You're listening to the Birth Matters podcast, episode 105.
I think that may have been like transition possibly when I was like, what was I thinking? But quickly you're like, well, I'm here and I'm doing this. I remember feeling the baby moving. Like I remember feeling him turning into position. And if it hadn't been for the midwife telling me he's just moving into position or telling me that that's what was going on was really helpful. And it was just amazing. I couldn't believe that I could feel him moving, and it was just an amazing thing. It's not something you think about until it happens, and then just an incredible thing to feel.
Hey there, and welcome to the Birth Matters Show. I'm your host, Lisa Graves Taylor, founder of Birth Matters NYC and director of East River Doula Collective. I'm a childbirth educator, birth doula, and lactation counselor, and have been passionately supporting growing families since 2009. This show is here to lessen your overwhelm on the journey into parenthood by equipping and encouraging you with current, best evidence info and soulful interviews with parents and birth pros. Please keep in mind, the information on this show is not intended as medical advice or to diagnose or treat any medical conditions. Here's a bit about today's story. Melissa had her first baby as a teen, but second baby 15 years later with a different partner and with an early pregnancy loss in between. Each journey was very different, and she shares in today's episode how and why she made quite different choices for her most recent birthing process. This included switching from obstetrical care to hospital midwifery care to ultimately having an unmedicated birth in a freestanding birthing center in Washington state. She shares feeling instant love for her firstborn like she'd never known. She then details experiencing grief stemming from her previous early pregnancy loss during her third pregnancy and shares how that loss created anxiety and hesitation to bond with baby during pregnancy. But then, Melissa shares a reclamation of confidence in her body through birthing her second son. Melissa also shares a bit about how easy breastfeeding was with her first son, yet how much more challenging both breastfeeding and pumping was her second time around. And just a quick content warning, though you probably already picked up on it in the description, pregnancy loss will be mentioned and detailed in this story. Before we jump into today's story, just a few quick announcements, both for expectant parents as well as for doulas. Do you have your free Pack for Your Best Birth list yet? This is a great way to start some practical preparation for the big day and really start envisioning your ideal birth. All you have to do is go to birthmattersonline.com/pack to grab it. You'll also have the opportunity to take a free online mini course that will help you more thoroughly prep for a positively transformative birth. Again, that's birthmattersonline.com/pack. And if you're due with a baby in the next few months, we want to be sure you know that we offer several formats of our all-in-one birth class series to fit various needs and schedules. We offer group birth classes in Astoria, Queens, and we just updated the options to go through the end of the year. Those fill up fast, so be sure to grab your spot on the early side. We also offer private classes as well as an online Netflix-style version of our all-in-one course. To check out more details or sign up, visit birthmattersnyc.com. And the final announcement is for new or newish doulas who have already completed your doula training. We'd love for you to apply for East River Doula Collective's Fall Mentorship Program. We're accepting applications until September 8th, and the program will run from October to May. Visit eastriverdoulas.nyc/apply for the details and link to apply. All right, let's jump into Melissa's story. Hi, Melissa. How are you doing today?
I'm great, Lisa. Thank you.
So glad to have you here to share with us. Melissa is not one of my students. She is actually one of our podcast listeners. She doesn't live in the New York area, unlike most of the guests I have on the show. You're in Washington, right? Take a moment to introduce yourself, would you?
Sure. My name's Melissa. I live actually just outside of Olympia, Washington, the capital city, in a town called Tumwater. I live here with my husband. I have a 16-year-old son, and my second is just turning a year old. I'm a state employee. I'm actually a night custodian. I work on Capitol campus and I work at night, and then my husband works during the day. That's really been nice for with having a baby. That's really worked out great for us.
Tag teaming is really nice. My husband and I were blessed to be able to tag team as well and to never have to do daycare. I know not everybody has that luxury, but it's really nice when you can do that, even though it becomes, passing ships in the night with your husband or your partner. But we somehow found a way to make it work, and we were really grateful for that. So I'm happy to hear that you guys can do that as well.
It is challenging because all week we're passing each other, and then it's not until weekends we're like, oh, hi.
Yeah, you have to really carve out some quality time to spend together to reconnect so you don't drift apart. Can you share just a little bit about how you found the podcast? And I think you said you listened to every episode, which just, of course, delights my heart. I'm so grateful to hear that when I hear that people are listening and getting something out of it. But could you just share a little bit about that?
Yeah, because I'm a night custodian, I can listen to audiobooks and podcasts through my entire 8-hour shift. And when I decided that I wanted to have an unmedicated physiological birth, in order to ease my nerves about it, I wanted to learn about it. And so I was searching for books. I use Audible. So I was searching for books and I typed birth in, and your podcast came up. And I had never even listened to a podcast before. So I'm like, well, I'll give this a shot. And I started it and I didn't stop until I finished it. So I think you just had your first 2 seasons.
Yeah, 72 episodes.
I think I started with the oldest and then just listened every night until I finished the end of them. And I just really enjoyed listening to other people's stories. And I actually really enjoyed listening to even though it was New York specific, I found it really interesting listening to that people have to call an Uber. That's not something I would have to think about because, I don't live in New York. I found that very interesting, even though there's a lot of different things, still a lot of similar things that I would be considering in my own birth. So yeah, I really enjoyed it and really connected with it.
And I think you had mentioned to me that the commentary, some things that you appreciated about the kind of childbirth ed commentary based on topics that came up in the stories.
Yeah, I really enjoyed with your guests. You always ask the questions that I would be wondering to myself. I always appreciated that you would pause on a subject or revisit a subject at the end of the podcast and talk more about it, because I was really starting from scratch on what I needed to know about giving birth. And so when you would touch on these subjects, I was really learning a lot and soaking it all in, because I obviously I had no idea what to expect. My first birth, I was induced with an epidural. I didn't really feel like I was in the driver's seat. I felt like a passenger, just kind of seeing how things would go. With this one, I wanted to be in the driver's seat with it, and I didn't know what to expect. Just having every little piece of knowledge that I could get, or wisdom that I could get from you and other women, was so invaluable to me.
Thank you for sharing that. So let's start with your first birth quite a few years ago. If you want to just kind of give us a little context about why you made the decisions with this most recent birth that you did, by giving us that context of the first birth and that journey.
So my first son, he's just turned 16 this January. So he was born in 2006, which feels like yesterday, but also feels like a lifetime ago. I was living just outside of Austin, and Landon was born in Round Rock, Texas. I'm not exactly sure, what kind of birth options were actually available, because I just assumed that I would be going with obstetrician, which is what I did. And he was great. He was an old, very clinical, traditional, exactly what you would expect from an obstetrician. He'd been practicing for decades. I mean, I was only 19 going on 20 when I had landed. And so he could have been like he had been doing it for decades. But he was a very nice man. He did everything like you would expect a very clinical by the book obstetrician to do. He had suggested that I come in and be induced on my due date. And I thought that was a great idea. I was like, all right, yeah, let's do that. That was the plan. I was going to come in and be induced on my due date. I was meant to come in that evening or the evening before. And the plan was that I would come and they would start, I think they started cytotech that evening. And when I got there, I remember they could tell that I was having contractions at the time, but I didn't know that I was having contractions. They're like, oh, look, you're having contractions. And I was like, oh, surprise. So we did the cervical softener is what we were using. And then I had that overnight. And then in the morning, they came in to check me. When I went in that night, I was about a centimeter dilated. And if I remember, by the time they checked me in the morning, I was closer to 3 or 4. I was managing them pretty fine from what I can recall. I was able to sleep through the night and everything. And when they came and checked me in the morning, they decided to start the Pitocin and break my waters. I was like, sure, let's do that if that's going to move things along. And I don't know if it was the Pitocin or my water being broken or a combination of the two. But as soon as that happened, I was like, give me the epidural. I knew going into that I was going to have an epidural because my mindset was, why wouldn't I? Why wouldn't you have an epidural?
Very common mindset, sure.
Why would I not have it? And so I did. I was in a bed the whole time. And I think Landon was born at 2:03 p.m. And I remember once I had the epidural in, it worked really well. I couldn't even feel my own leg. I was totally numb. I couldn't feel anything. I couldn't even feel a sensation to push, nothing. I remember when it was time to push, other people had to lift my legs for me. I couldn't even do that. I had to, put them up in the stirrups. And I believe that I didn't push for very long. I recall it felt like minutes, like when it was finally time to come in and push. I was given an episiotomy. I believe it was just a matter of practice for this obstetrician that he just did it. I don't remember if I was asked about it or not. I just remember that it had been done. And Landon, I think it's just a couple of pushes, and Landon was born and he was wrapped in a towel and placed on my chest pretty quickly. I think they cut his cord right away. I don't remember any delayed cord clamping or cord cutting or anything like that. Yeah, he came right to my chest. I don't remember delivering the placenta. I think I was with him. I still had the epidural and I couldn't feel anything. I basically didn't know at all what was going on down there, especially once he was in my arms. I was consumed with love. I couldn't believe how much I loved him when he was handed to me. I'd never felt that, that's the kind of love that you couldn't explain to me beforehand what that was going to feel like. And I was really bonded to Landon while I was pregnant with him. I actually really loved being pregnant. I didn't have very many symptoms, a little bit of nausea and heartburn, but I really loved being pregnant with Landon so much that when he was actually born, I kind of grieved not being pregnant anymore because I loved it so much. But yeah, he was born and I was so in love with him. I was still so in love with him once he was put in my arms. And I think I stayed in the hospital a couple of days with him. I have a really vivid memory of the nurses wanting me to get up and go to the bathroom. And I was like, oh, no, I don't need to go to the bathroom. I remember Landon's paternal grandmother was coming to the hospital to see him. And they're like, well, you should get up and try to use the bathroom. And I stood up. And I was like, all right, fine. I don't have to go, but if you say so, I'll go to the bathroom. And I stood up, and as soon as I stood up, I had peed all over myself. Apparently, which I didn't know at the time, your bladder goes into a little bit of shock about all this space all of a sudden, so your brain's not getting the signal, which she explained to me at the time. But I just remember, I'm 19 or 20, and my son's grandmother's coming to see him, and I literally just peed all over the floor. So that was a funny thing, but I kept Landon in the room with me the whole time. I didn't want him to go away. I didn't want him to go to the nursery. I wanted him right there with me. He only left for a couple of things, but otherwise I had him with me in the room the whole time. And I actually had a pretty good experience at this hospital. I remember I thought the food was great. I thought the nurses were great. Nobody felt really overbearing in any kind of way. I felt really taken care of. Overall, I had a pretty good experience with Landon's birth in the hospital. And I went home with Landon. Landon's father, he went to work probably a day or two after Landon was born. And so I recovered at home with him, just mostly him and I. I saw my obstetrician once at my 6-week appointment. And I remember feeling like it took a long time to feel better again. And one way that I can earmark a little bit about how long it took was that I remember going to my 6-week appointment with my obstetrician. And I was still in a lot of pain and discomfort. And I was running out of the pain medication I had been prescribed. And I remember asking him, I'm about to run out of pain medication. I'm still really uncomfortable and a lot of discomfort. And he had said, you'll be fine in a couple of days. And I remember being like, you're crazy. I'm not going to be fine. Ultimately, he was right. I was feeling fine in a couple of days. But that's how I know it took at least 6 weeks. It was probably around the 7-week mark when I was finally feeling better. But I do remember that, I was like, I need more pain medication. And the doctor being like, no, you'll be fine. And I was, what? No, I'm not going to be fine. I feel miserable still. But I was fine. But it was probably about 7 weeks before I was not so uncomfortable anymore. And I think that was probably just healing from the episiotomy that he gave me is my best guess. I think my body was probably a little beat up from laboring on my back, even though the epidural, I couldn't feel anything, but I'm sure that I would assume that maybe that had something to do with how long it took me to feel better. So
it can, because when you're numbed, then your body can't tell you when you need to move out of a certain position. You lose those pain signals. So that sometimes it can bring about more backache or different aches afterwards. Mm-hmm. Well, so where do you want to go from there? You want to speed forward a few years?
I never thought Landon would be my only baby. I always wanted him to have siblings, but it just worked out that he would be 15 years older than Conrad, which was my second baby. Me and my husband had been married for, I have to think about this, 5 years or 4 years, I think, when we decided we were ready to have kids together.
So this is a different partner, right?
He's Landon's stepfather. And he's been in Landon's life since Landon was 4. We took a long time to get, married, and then a long time to decide we were ready to have a baby together. Actually, I think I was ready for a long time. Like I said, I wanted Landon to have siblings. I have 5 brothers and sisters myself, and we're all very close in age. So I was all on board with Landon having lots of siblings. But my husband, he kept waiting till he took a little bit more time to come around to feeling like he was ready. Even though he knew he wanted kids, he was always like waiting for that perfect time. So we were about 4 years after we were married, we decided that we were ready to have a baby. And I'd had an IUD in for about, I think, 10 years at that time. So I had specifically picked out an obstetrician when I knew I was ready to have my IUD out. And I wanted to make sure that I picked out an OBGYN that I really liked. I knew that I wanted a woman doctor. So I knew from the time that she would take out my IUD to the time that I had the baby, that she would be my care provider. And I wanted to make sure that I really picked out somebody that I liked. And so I did. I sought out an OBGYN that I really liked. And I had scheduled an appointment to have my IUD taken out. And I went and, in meeting her and having that taken out, I remember expressing a little bit of fear about my age, which is silly now that I know as much as I know. But having had Landon at 19 going on 20, and now I'm 34 going on 35, I was like, I'm getting so much, I'm so old. How am I going to recover? Will I be okay? Can I do this? And she kind of laughed a little bit at me being worried about it. She was like, you're still young. You're a perfect candidate for having a baby. And she actually made me feel really good about that I would be just fine having a baby. And she assured me that it didn't matter that if I had a baby a year ago or 15 years ago, that my body would know exactly what to do, no matter how long it had been. So she was really great and comforting in that moment and assuring me that I was a perfect candidate for having a baby. So I felt really good after that. So when I had my IUD out, and I really didn't know what to expect of my cycles, as through the time that I had my IUD, and this was one with, I know some IUDs don't use hormones and some do, and this was a hormonal IUD. And so my cycles would go from either being non-existent to being very light and sporadic. And so once I had it out, I didn't know at all what to expect with my cycles. She did advise me to let my body have a normal cycle and then try, which is what my husband and I did. And it's our first try. I ended up pregnant. And I was very excited about that. I can't say I was surprised that I got pregnant as quick as I did, because I was shocked when I got pregnant with Landon. And I was like, well, that was way easier than I thought. So I was expecting it to be easy because it had been easy for me in the past. So we found out, and this was in probably around November. And of course, I let my husband know, and we decided that we would wait until after our first appointment to confirm the pregnancy before we told anybody, which it was going to be January before that was scheduled because the holidays and everything. So we had several weeks to wait before I would go and have that pregnancy confirmed, because I knew pretty early on that I was pregnant because we were trying. So it was very early. So it was going to be several weeks before I would go and get that confirmed and dated and stuff. And so I remember through the holidays, that Thanksgiving and that Christmas, I was just so nauseous, which was different from my pregnancy when, and I didn't want to eat anything. I was exhausted and I was nauseous. I think probably around Christmas, I do remember the nausea easing up. And I was trying to convince my husband at the time that we should tell his parents, because it was going to be their first grandbaby. We should tell them for Christmas and surprise them. And he was the one who was like, no, we should wait. Just wait till after the appointment. It was a good thing that we decided to wait, because when I went in for my appointment in January, I was expecting to be, I think, 10 or 11 weeks along. And I knew that because I knew my dates exactly, because I had been trying to get pregnant. And I had gone to that appointment by myself because I expected it to be a very routine appointment where I was just going to go in. We were going to confirm the pregnancy. And then I'll let my husband know everything was, this is what we did. It wasn't that exciting. But we went in and they had the ultrasound in the room, which is not quite as extensive as the ones down in radiology. But she was looking and she was questioning how far along I thought I was. And I kept telling her, I was insisting I was 10 or 11 weeks. And she's like, maybe you're not as far along as you think you are, but we're going to send you down to radiology and have them take a better look. I think I didn't go straight down there. I think she said radiology was going to contact me and set up an appointment. I went home to wait basically the radiology department to have me come in. And I think my appointment was on a Friday. And they did call up, but they'd set up the appointment for that Monday. And so I had to wait the weekend. But I knew when she sent me home that something wasn't right, because I knew my dates. I knew that if she didn't think that I was as far along that I knew I was, that probably something wasn't right. So I did go home and tell my husband that I didn't think something was right. I think maybe she had mentioned, are you sure you're not 6 or 7 weeks? And I'm like, no, I'm definitely 10 or 11 weeks for sure. But she didn't give me anything more than that. So I do remember being a little bit frustrated over the weekend, being like, I know that something's not right. And I wish she would have just told me. And it wasn't the obstetrician. This was a nurse or something who had done it. Or maybe because the obstetrician practice, it was a obstetrician and midwife practice together. So it wasn't my obstetrician who I had seen that day. So I do remember being frustrated. I'm I know that something's going on. And I wish, instead of being left with hope that even though I knew that something was wrong, I still had that hope that maybe there wasn't, because nobody said that there's something going on. So I did that Monday. I went to the radiology and they confirmed that basically the pregnancy had stopped developing at about week 6 or 7. And they called it a miscarriage, which was a term I never heard before. I assumed that if you were having a miscarriage, that you would know that you were having a miscarriage. I didn't realize that your body could hold on to a pregnancy and you would think you were pregnant, even though really were. So I had no idea that was something that could happen. I knew miscarriages happened and I knew that they were common. I think that was what caught me the most off guard, is that I felt like I had been betrayed. My body tricked me this whole time. I thought, because in my mind, I'm doing the math and I'm like, that puts me back in November or the beginning of December when the pregnancy stopped developing. I'm 11 weeks in and still I'm holding on to this pregnancy and I'm going through all the symptoms of a pregnancy, but it's not going anywhere. And at the time, I was actually quite logical about the way that I thought about it. It wasn't super upset or emotional. My sister experienced a late-term loss, or she was probably halfway through her pregnancy and learned that her daughter, she wouldn't survive after she was born. And so she had a late-term loss. So I was replaying, telling myself, this happens all the time, and this is nothing. Some women go through losses that are much harder than this. I'm just going to try again. This isn't, this will be fine. It's not that big of a deal. So in the moment, it didn't impact me as much as it did down the road. I think down the road is when it affected my pregnancy with Conrad, in that I had a lot of anxiety about it. And I kept thinking that I kept waiting for feeling like it would be okay before I really believed that I was going to end up with a baby at the end of it. So even though in the moment I was very logical, it did impact my later pregnancy. I just had a lot of anxiety about it. And it might have impacted how much I bonded with the baby a little bit, I think, at least comparatively with Wayne. And I was so bonded and connected. But I think I was just always waiting for the other shoe to drop with Conrad. I was like, well, wait.
Yeah, that's understandable.
Yeah. So then after I decided I was given the option, I could do a DNC, or I could take, I think it was Prostol at home, or I could wait and let my body do what it needed to do on its own. Those were the options that I was given. And I decided that I would take misoprostol at home. I didn't want to do the DNC, and I didn't want to wait because I had already been feeling so sick. I felt like I've been sick for this long. I'm ready to not have these pregnancy symptoms for no reason anymore. And also because I'm still working, I work full time. I wanted to have a little bit of control about when it would happen instead of being surprised by it happening. So it was lucky that I was coming into a holiday weekend. And so I had this long weekend ahead of me that I could go through the miscarriage and not have to go straight back to work. So that's what I did. I think it was on Saturday I started the process. And I remember it seemed rather quick. It was just a matter of hours. And I do remember losing more blood than I was expecting to lose. I thought I was going to faint at one point because I lost so much blood. I was expecting it, I guess, to be more like having a period, having my normal menstrual cycle. And it was much more than that, which I don't know if that was explained to me and I just didn't take it seriously or if it was missed in communication. But I was expecting it to be like having a menstrual cycle, and then it didn't realize it would be a little bit harder than that. And so at one point, I had to call my husband and be like, I need you to bring me a cup of fruit or something because I'm feeling like I'm going to pass out. I had that knowledge because I donated blood in the past. And one of the things they do is they have you have a snack or something so that you don't get lightheaded. And I remember thinking it's a good thing that I had this knowledge from donating blood, because otherwise I wouldn't have known. I would have probably just passed out here in the bathroom. So that was another thing I remember thinking, I wish they would have explained this a little better to me because I would have been more prepared for this.
It's important.
I had that miscarriage and it passed just fine on its own. And I was actually quite sore the next couple of days, which I wasn't expecting again. So I think I started on a Saturday, and then I didn't go back to work until a Tuesday because I think it was a holiday that Monday. But still, when I went back to work on that Tuesday, I was still really sore. I didn't realize how much cramping I would have in my uterus for a couple of days even after. And I was very tired, which I wasn't prepared for. I was surprised on going back to work Tuesday that I was still quite tired and still recovering from it. I just wasn't prepared for it to be as challenging as I was. I was just naive about the whole process, I guess. But yeah, it was maybe only a couple of days later that I was feeling just fine. They did track my HCP levels again until they got back down to the threshold they were looking for. And then that just let them know that there was nothing left behind and that everything had passed on its own without needing any medical intervention. And then once my levels were back to normal, I was cleared to basically try again. And it wasn't until May now where we did conceive again. It was 8 months from the time that we started, which really isn't that long, but it felt like a lifetime. I really wanted a summer baby because my older boy is a winter baby, and I really wanted a summer baby. And I remember that mark had come and gone. I'm like, well, now it's having another winter baby, but that's fine. Not really an issue, but I do remember there goes my summer baby.
Don't always get to choose, do we?
No, I think I'm probably destined for, it's my destiny to have all the holidays crammed into one. That's like all the birthdays, all the holidays, all just crammed into this one part of the year. So it felt like a really long time, but it was really only 8 months from the time that I had my IUD out until I conceived Conrad, my second baby. And I think that having that desire for a summer baby made it feel like even longer, because I was like, every day that ticked away, I knew that was going away. So it made it feel like, I'm still not pregnant. I really wanted that summer baby. But yeah, it was 8 months, and then we finally conceived Conrad.
Right. So then how was that pregnancy, and how did you make some different choices?
I went back to the obstetrician. And actually, I should actually backtrack. When I first was pregnant with the baby that I miscarried, I had called a birth center just to feel them out. Like, well, if this is an option for me, when do I come see you? Like, do I come see you right now, or do I confirm the pregnancy and come in? And they were like, oh, you can come at anytime, it's fine. But then I had ended up losing that pregnancy and didn't pursue it any more than just a call to inquire about them. So when I was pregnant again, I went to the obstetrician, and at the women's health clinic where the obstetrician is, I learned that they also had midwives as an option. And so even though I really loved my obstetrician, I'm like, well, maybe I should try midwives. My first son was born in 2006. And in 2009, I had seen the business of being born. And even though at the time I wasn't sure if or when I would have other kids, I do remember thinking that is exactly all those things that I'm seeing that they're talking about is exactly what happened to me. I was told exactly the same things. The only difference is that my birth was successful. The cascading interventions didn't turn into a cesarean section for me. So it did plant the seed. So when I heard that the obstetrician practice had midwives, I was like, oh, well, maybe I should try the midwives. And so I had signed up, instead of seeing the obstetrician as much as I loved her, I signed up to see her midwife team instead. And they were great. I thought they were great at the time. I saw them until I was about, I think, 24 weeks along. But in the back of my head, I kept thinking about this birth center that I had contacted that is right down the road. But I kept thinking that I wanted to make sure that this pregnancy was okay. Before I, bothered them with their time, I kept on wanting to make sure. So it's like, I better wait until I get out of that 12-week mark. And then it's like, well, maybe I should wait until the NIPT testing comes back. Maybe I should wait until my anatomy scan and make sure that after the anatomy scan that everything is fine. And then at my anatomy scan, I found out that he had a developmentis cord insertion, which I had never heard before. And they kind of made me worried about it. They're like, you should come in every month, or I believe they wanted me to come once a month for growth scans. They told me it could impact his ability to grow and that could cause some hazards in giving birth. And so they just wanted to check on it regularly. So then I had some nerves about that. And it was probably I was about 24 weeks along when my husband actually was like, what about that birth center? You were really interested in it and you should call them. And then I'm like, well, I don't know about, the insurance, and it might be a hassle to switch. It's like, you should just call them. And so I was like, all right, fine. And so I did call and I found out that they took my insurance, and this is a freestanding birth center in Olympia. It's called the Birth House, and it's ran by Around the Circle Midwifery. So I found out that they took my insurance and that they would actually do all the work of transferring me. And then they set up an appointment for me right away. And it was actually quite easy to transfer over. And I was like, all right, well, I guess we'll do this. And part of the drive was at that time. So this was, I think, around June of 2020, or I would have been, maybe it was a little bit later, but it was in this late summer of 2020. And so there was going to be COVID restrictions in the hospital. So it was a combination of wanting to avoid a lot of the restrictions or anxieties that were happening in the hospital setting, and as well as just wanting to try something different than what I had with Landon. I wanted to kind of feel a little more in the driver's seat with Conrad's birth. I decided at 24 weeks to make the switch over. And my first couple of appointments were telehealth. And then when I think after 30 weeks is when I started doing in person. And I think that was purely because of COVID at the time. But I noticed right away there was a noticeable difference in the kind of care I was getting. Even though I was seeing midwives in the hospital setting, they still followed a very clinical way of doing things. I still felt like every appointment, my age and my weight was being brought up. That was a common, it felt like at the time, it's all we talk about. It's I know I'm old and I'm heavy and my BMI is high. No. I got it. But it was they wanted, because of my age and my weight, that extra tests. I had to do the gestational diabetes, or they wanted me to do gestational diabetes twice. I can't remember. I think I did do gestational diabetes, one early on and one at the standards. And then, of course, they wanted the extra scans. But when I switched over to the Around the Circle midwifery, which is ran by 4 midwives, it was all centered around me. I felt like I had more of control. If there were tests or things that could be done, it always felt really optional. They always framed it as something that I could do if I wanted to, and answered any of my questions about it that I might have. But I always felt like I had more control. I felt like in the hospital setting, still felt like a lot of fear mongering, which was, I felt it really because I was having so much anxiety about the pregnancy being viable that any little thing they took or they said that kind of where they were talking about, high risks or this or that, or that I took it really seriously because I was anxious from having the miscarriage. And so when I switched over to the other midwife team out of the hospital, all of a sudden I'm being told that the developmental cord insertion is just a variation of normal and it's nothing to be concerned about, that I'm perfectly healthy age and weight. We didn't weigh, but maybe towards the end of the pregnancy, I think maybe I got weighed once or twice. But if they would ask me, do you want to be weighed, that kind of thing, they always ask before they did any kind of exam. And then also they just would ask me how I was doing, how am I feeling? And and my appointments were like an hour long instead of 10 or 15 minutes, so I really felt like I could trust them. Yeah. And so that anxiety about my pregnancy really eased up once I switched to the midwifery model of care.
It's huge.
It was huge for me. I really felt like I could relax about my pregnancy once I switched over. But then my anxiety switched from being about my pregnancy being viable to now I'm like, okay, now I'm committed to doing an unmedicated birth. I don't know what I'm doing. And so to ease the anxieties about having an unmedicated birth, I need to learn about how to give birth. I don't know what I'm doing. And so I dove into listening to books and your podcast every night. I have a job that I can listen my full 8 hours to audiobooks. And so I think I listened to something like 12 books total in the last half of my pregnancy.
Did you have any favorites?
But the one that actually was my favorite was Ida May's Guide to Childbirth, which I remember before I listened to. I think I heard about it for the first time, probably on your podcast. I knew who Ida May Gaskin was because I had seen The Business of Being Born. So I'd heard her name. And so then I kept hearing this reoccurring recommendation on your podcast for her Guide to Childbirth book. And at first I was like, this is so way too crunchy for me.
That's how I felt too when I first read it.
It's like, this is way too crunchy for me, but I'll give it a try. And I just loved it. I really did. By the time I finished her book, all my fears about childbirth went away. All of them. When I finished that book, I was like, my body knows what to do. I just have to trust it to do what it needs to do. So that one was huge. I also really enjoyed Rebecca Decker's Babies Are Not Pizza. That really helped me to understand what's going on the clinical side and the culture there and why decisions in that setting might be made versus the midwifery model. So I really loved her. And I think I heard about evidence-based birth on your podcast, and that was a huge resource for me in making decisions and understanding options and why we might come to the decisions we do about the medical advice we would get. And then another one was Emily Oster's Expecting Better. Hers was really good too, about just making decisions in pregnancy and just understanding why I might be given this advice versus this advice. And I really felt like that helped me to feel confident in the decisions I was making. A combination of those three books really gave me confidence in making certain decisions.
Great. Thank you. One thing you said just a few minutes ago that I just wanted to amplify for listeners, I'm not going to get how you worded it just right, but when you were talking about the difference in the hospital midwives care and the ones at the birthing center, the freestanding birthing center, you said something along the lines of, I believe that the midwives in the birthing center setting would tell you before they would do anything to your body or something like that, or ask you permission, something along those lines.
Yeah.
And I just want to point out for listeners, that is called trauma-informed care, and all care providers should be trained in trauma-informed care and always should ask before they ever touch your body and tell you what they're about to do and ask for your permission. That is not standard in most of our clinical settings, and there's just a lack of training and knowledge about trauma-informed care. And it is so important given the statistics of how many people are trauma or abuse survivors or assault, all of those things. And so I just wanted to amplify that beautiful aspect of the midwifery model of care that is more common with home birth midwives and with birthing center midwives, because it's really important. And not that there aren't trauma-informed care providers in hospital settings, but there are certainly fewer of them in my experience.
Definitely. It really just always made me feel like I had final say in anything that was happening to me. And that was really invaluable. And it also made me feel that like they trust, not only do I have a trust in them, but it also in a way made me feel like they trusted me, trusted what I was telling them. That was important too.
That's huge. We all deserve dignity and respect in life in general, and including here in this journey through pregnancy and birth. And that's what this midwifery model of care is really, really focused on much of the time. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. So go ahead. You had finished sharing about some resources, addressing the anxiety that you were having about now how switching to this birth setting for an unmedicated birth, finding these ways to build your confidence.
Right. Yeah. I think those were the three really big ones. Another couple of good ones that I listened to was Giving Birth Like a Feminist by Millie Hill, I think was a really good one. She actually lives over in England. And so what was interesting about hers was that she kind of highlighted that the birth justice was kind of a missed opportunity in the Me Too movement. And so that was an interesting take. And I agreed with her. I thought that the Me Too movement would have been a great way to encompass our birth rights also. And so hers was a really interesting and powerful read. It was also interesting to hear that even over in England, that they face some of the same challenges in their care that we do, which was news to me. So I thought, it's easy to believe that this is just our problem, but it's a world problem of the birth injustice for women. And then the other one was Birth Without Fear by January Harsh. Hers was really good too.
Thank you for sharing all those. I will be sure to link to all of it.
The books, and then of course your podcast and hearing women tell their birth stories was also huge. I think that hearing other people's birth stories in combination with Ina May's Guide to Childbirth was the most important part for easing my anxiety. Just every night listening to somebody's story about giving birth, the good, the bad, and the ugly, like all of it was so good to hear, because otherwise I think all the birth stories that I would hear were always like the scary things about birth or the way it went wrong. And you don't often hear about the way things go right, or even in the face of challenges, that it can still come out the other end with a really positive experience. And I didn't know that. I didn't hear those words until I started hearing other women's birth stories. And now I wish we could talk about it more with each other, with our moms, with our grandmas, with our sisters, with our friends. I wish we normalized it. I wish we took the fear out of giving birth. I think that would make a huge difference. No matter what way you choose to give birth, I think that normalizing it and taking the fear out of it is an important thing to do. So hearing other women's birth stories was key in easing all of my anxieties. And I went from being very anxious about giving birth to just being really excited to try it and to go for it. So I think by the time that I was due, I was ready to go. I was ready. I didn't have any fear anymore.
That's amazing. I love it. I love that you were so proactive in seeking out those ways to reduce your anxiety and build that confidence. Really, really beautiful. So then feel free to jump into your birth story if you're ready.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So I worked until I was about 37 weeks along. And then I think I was just over 37, like 37 and a half. My team of midwives, they were super great about getting me out on a medical leave. And I'm not even sure exactly what the paperwork said. But anyways, I got medical leave before my actual maternity leave or bonding time started. I think I could potentially have up to 6 weeks, but I think I took 2 weeks before my due date. And my medical leave was going until the baby was born. And then once the baby was born, then my bonding time would start, which Washington State is one of the few states that has paid family medical leave.
There's so few.
Yeah, it's actually, and that was a factor in when we decided to have kids too. So Washington State residents, we started paying into it in 2019, and it became available to use as of 2020. We use it goes through the same employment security that like unemployment does. So we pay it's a similar thing where we pay tax into it. And then when we need to use it, we call employment security and it gets paid back out to us. We get 12 weeks of paid bonding time, and that's both for mothers and fathers. And there's other circumstances, like if you've had a C-section, I think you get 16 weeks of paid time, paid bonding time. And then I could have had up to 6 weeks on medical leave. That was also the Paid Family Medical Leave Act. And it pays, I think it's 90% of your income is what you get with Washington's paid family leave. Just after 37 and a half weeks, I took medical leave off, and I was ready to keep staying pregnant because I was like, the longer I'm pregnant, the longer my paid leave is. I wasn't in any hurry to kick him out because I was getting paid medical leave before bonding leave. So I was like, all right, you just stick in there. And I spent weeks just making like freezer meals. I spent all my time doing that. I think at 34 weeks, I did start seeing a Webster certified chiropractor. I think that was another thing I learned on your podcast. I'd never even heard of a Webster certified chiropractor before listening to you, but I did start seeing her, and that was at 34 weeks. And with the idea that I wanted the baby to be in an optimal position to be as successful as possible. And also I wanted to be able to finish out my last couple of weeks of work because my work entails like carrying a backpack back, and going up and down a lot of stairs. And I was like, I have a couple of weeks left and I need to be able to finish out these last couple of weeks. And yeah, Dr. Andrea Shaw in Olympia, and she was fantastic. I love her. I would see her. I'll see her again if I ever get the chance. So I saw her from 34 weeks all the way until I went into labor. That was really good. It was also because we're in the middle of COVID, it was like kind of nice to have a person to see outside of the house. So that was a nice little that too.
That alone is therapeutic.
Yeah, so I saw her and I was actually feeling really great. And the last couple of weeks I was making my freezer meals and just kind of like nesting and getting things ready. And that was really nice. I just kind of, I guess, in a way, like meditated a lot about like mid-birth and thinking about it and envisioning what it would look like and how I wanted it to go. There was a full moon coming up at the end of January. My estimated due date, I think, was February 5th. And there was a full moon a week early before his birthday. And I was like, there's a full moon and there's a slight chance of snow and it's my best friend's birthday. And so maybe he'll be born on this full moon and it'll snow and it'll be on her birthday. But that day came and went. He was not born on that full moon and it didn't snow. I wasn't having any cervical exams. I didn't want to be misled one way or the other. I didn't want to nothing to be going on and then to think, well, then it's not going to happen anytime soon, or something to be going on, like to be a centimeter dilated, and I've been a centimeter dilated for a week, but then maybe secretly, internally thinking, now it might happen because I'm a centimeter dilated. So I didn't want to give myself hopes or one way or the other. I didn't want to do cervical exams. I didn't do any. But then once my estimated due date came and went, I did start to get a little bit of anxiety because I was worried about being risked back to the hospital, which I just didn't want to go. I just didn't want to do that. I had an overwhelming fear, I guess, of having a cesarean section a little bit because I was worried about how long it would take my body to heal. And I'm like, I'm older. It's going to take me longer to heal. So I was really trying to do everything I could to reduce any harm to my body. Yeah, that's why I was so afraid about being risked out to the hospital because I wanted as little harm to my body as possible. And so when my due date came and went, I was having a little bit of anxiety about that. But I wasn't interested in doing any of that at-home kickstart labor kind of things. I still wanted to just let it happen. I still wanted to wait for spontaneous labor. I guess probably because I just wanted to see how I wanted my body to do it. I wanted to see that my body could do it. And so waiting for spontaneous labor and not doing anything to try to speed it along or, check to see if it was happening. And I didn't want any of that. I just sat back and I waited. And it only started to get to me after I went over my due date. I was worried. One of the midwives, her name was Carol Ann, she assured me, she was like, I've never had anybody risked out because they went over 42 weeks. She's like, I've never had it happen. She's like, we will risk you out if you did. But she's like, I've never had it happen. She's like, I promise the baby will come. There was a lot of people with birthdays in our family at that time. So we're, guessing maybe he'll be on this person's birthday or that person's birthday. My dad's birthday was February 14th. And I'm like, maybe it'll be the 14th, but I'll have to go 9 days late. So I'm like, oh, maybe he'll stay in there till the 14th. But 9 days late was like a number that I was like scared of in my head, because my mom was 9 days late with me and I was over 11 pounds. And so I'm like, oh, but what if he's huge? I say he, but we actually decided not to know what the gender of the baby was.
Mm-hmm.
We wanted to keep it a surprise. And so we didn't know at all what we were having. And I could tell that the baby was bigger than Landon. He was taking up my entire torso. I could not breathe. It felt so big. The baby wasn't sitting like low in my pelvis. I wasn't waddling or having trouble walking or anything like that. But he was so high up in my rib cage, I felt like I couldn't breathe at all. And so I could tell that the baby was bigger than the last baby. And he sat in the same position the whole time. He didn't actually move a lot. He sat in the same position and and there was no relief because he just stayed in this one position the whole time. And I think at one point, one of the midwives asked me how big did I think he was relative to my last baby. I was like, oh, this baby's bigger. Definitely. Yeah, I think so. I think so too. That was the other thing. Every day that ticked by, I knew the baby was getting bigger. I knew he was going to be quite a big baby. And then I think I'd gone over 41 weeks, which I kept reminding myself that it was very normal to be at 41 weeks. And of course, the midwives were reminding me too. And I saw my favorite. She was the midwife that I saw most frequently. And I had a real connection with her. Her name was Michelle. And she was like, I'm the midwife on call the next couple of days. So, if anything happens, it'll be me. And so secretly, I'm like, all right, that's great. But we did set up a plan for the next week to do a non-stress test because I would be coming up on 42 weeks. I was like a Monday, I was supposed to go in to do a non-stress test because the following Friday, I would be at 42 weeks. And so we did schedule all those appointments because I would have to go up to the hospital care team to do like those kinds of things. And so we set that up, which again, I'm having a little bit of anxiety. I'm like, oh, I don't want to go in and do this. I'm worried that the baby's just not going to come on time. And then I think it was not that night after my appointment, but the next day, the evening of the next day. But I was still not having any kind of symptoms or signs. I never had Braxton Hicks. I had no symptoms or any reason to think that I was going into labor. I was feeling basically the same as I had been. I just couldn't breathe. I wasn't sleeping very well. Our bedroom is down a flight of stairs and our only bathroom is up a flight and a half of stairs. So every night I'm going up a flight and a half of stairs to pee every couple of hours, but otherwise I had no signs or symptoms that I was going to be in labor anytime soon. I think the night of the 10th, I did have this weird, it's almost hard to describe, right in my pelvis, right along where my bikini line is, this feeling of the ligaments or something, and they were swollen. And I mentioned it to my husband. I'm like, I feel like the ligaments in my pelvis are swollen or something. It's really weird. It wasn't painful, but it was just this weird feeling right along my bikini line. It's hard to really describe what it was, but I've had that feeling before I went to bed. And then I went to bed and I basically woke up the next morning in labor. I woke up, I thought I had to pee, and I got out of bed and my water broke. And I knew it, without a doubt, I knew it was my water break. And it surprised the heck out of me because I kept hearing that it's uncommon for your water to break first. I still don't believe that's true. I think it's more common than we think it is.
I do too. Every time I hear 10 to 20%, I'm like, I'm quite sure that it's a higher percentage among my clients. And I'm like, what is the research on? Did we do reliable research on this? Because I don't know.
Yeah, I often wonder about where that number comes from. Because I feel like every birth story I've since listened to, it seems at least half your water breaking before contractions start or at the beginning at the end. But I do remember being disappointed that my water broke first because I had heard that having your waters intact acted as a cushion for your contractions. And I did have a vivid memory of when my waters were broken with my first son, that's when everything became unbearable for me. And I got the epidural. I remember my waters being broken and it being painful. And then hearing that your waters intact can act as a cushion, I was hoping they would stay intact so that I could manage my pain level easier. But that wasn't the case. I woke up and my waters broke all over the place. I had heard somewhere, I'm not sure whether it was on your podcast or in books that I read, it depends on hand. And so I did have some Depends in my nightstand, and I just put them right on and I went upstairs. It was like 5:00, 5:15 in the morning. My husband was asleep, and I didn't wake him up because I had knew of the value of being rested. And so I let him be, and I went upstairs, and I think I showered off and put back on a clean Depends. And I wasn't having any contractions, but I was definitely leaking water everywhere. And it was supposed to snow that day. And so I just went out into the living room and opened the curtains. It was winter. And so I turned on the gas fireplace. I opened the curtains and I said, well, I guess I'll just sit here and wait for the snow or the contractions, whichever comes first. And I just kind of got comfy and kind of waited for things to get started. And it was probably like an hour before contractions actually started. And at first I was think that was a contraction. And then it was like 15 minutes later, the same feeling came again. Okay, that's definitely a contraction. It's very light. It was almost like butterflies in my stomach, kind of light feeling of contraction. I'm like, okay, this is definitely contraction. And I did remember as soon as I got up, I think I ate like a cup of yogurt because I wasn't hungry, but after listening to so many women's birth stories, I'm like, I better eat something. Well, I still want to. So I had a cup of yogurt when I first got up. And then I think when the contractions started an hour later, I better have a banana or something. So I ate a banana. Then I thought, well, I should probably pack my lunch. So I started working on packing. I made myself some like chicken bacon club wraps to pack up and bring with us to eat after the baby was born. So I just kind of puttered around and started checking things off my list and making sure I had things in order. It was probably about 8:00 when I could tell that things were kind of picking up a little bit. The contractions were getting a little bit stronger. And I thought, well, I should probably wake up Alex now so that if things pick up quickly, I don't wake him up and I'm frantic. So I did go down and wake up, because at the time we both worked evening shifts. And so we were late sleepers. And so I was trying to let him sleep as long as I could. So 8:00, I think probably now is a good time to wake him up. So I did. I went down there and I just kind of said something along the lines like, there's no rush, but my water broke. And I just wanted to let you know so that you can get up and kind of get your day started because I'm in labor. And so he was just, I think he was just like, oh, great. Awesome. I think that because I came at him and I was just like,
chill,
no rush, no problem, but maybe you should get out of bed. And so he did just that. He wasn't frantic in any way either. So he kind of got up and started doing his normal morning type of things. I don't think that, at that point, contractions still weren't very painful. They were coming and I could tell I was where I could feel them like coming in and going. It was instead of like, I could tell that they were coming in and like kind of peaking and going away. But I think about 8:00, that's when I could really tell that there was like a pattern about them. Yeah.
Did your midwives, given this was not your first time to give birth, did your midwives give you any sort of different advice than what you would have expected the first time based on all the birth stories you heard and everything as to when to call them or when to come to the birthing center?
So, yeah, I did have some instruction. One thing, I think it was Carol Ann, and I had actually asked her about when I should come, at what point, and she was like, if you want to come in and get seen, and if it's too early, you can always leave and come back. It's no big deal. But if you want to just come in and have your mind at ease about things, that's totally fine. I was GBS negative, so I didn't have to worry about that. But if I had been, I could have come in and start antibiotics and left and then come back. Like I wouldn't have to sit there and stay if I had been GBS positive. I think that's nice. Coming to mind because this had happened all in the same conversation while we were waiting for the GBS results still. But so, yeah, she did reassure me that just to call them. And then if I felt like I wanted to come in, then I could. And if not, if I still felt fine, I would need to. The birth center is only about 10 minutes away from my house. And so it wasn't very far to get there. A quick trip to get over there when I felt like it was necessary. So it was about 8:00. I gently woke him up. And I had also been thinking about that I need to call the birth center. But I was trying to be polite and I figured I'd wait till business hours. And then that way I could call the front desk instead of paging them, which I don't know why. I'm sure it wouldn't have mattered to them either way. But I was being polite and I figured I'd wait for the birth center to open and call the front desk. And when I pulled out my sheet with that are actually, I had it posted on the fridge about the things to look for that were like an emergency type of thing. It also encompassed like preeclampsia symptoms and things like that, hypertension. But anyways, so I had all these things, and then it's like when to call. And I realized when I took a second to look at the sheet, it also said when your water breaks, call just to let us know. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I maybe should have called them sooner, but I waited till 8 and I called. And the midwife that I had talked to, I think I had only met her. There's 4 total. And this one particular one, I just happened to have only met her one time. I think because I was scheduling on the same time days, I was seeing the 2 quite frequently, and I had only met this one time. But I think she must have just like glanced at my records or something, because she was like, well, this isn't your first time, so you'll know when it's time to go. And when it is, just head on over. And otherwise, I'll just check back in with us in 12 hours. And I wasn't going to, argue with her because I'm polite, of course. But in my head, I'm thinking, but I don't really know what time to go is going to be, because my first birth was controlled and I wasn't the one in control. And I had such a strong epidural, I literally couldn't feel a thing. So in my head, I'm like, well, I won't really know when time to go is, but hopefully I will. But I guess I'll just call her back when it's been 12 hours since my water broke. So in my head, I had this 12-hour number about when I was going to call her back. And I should say that one of them had mentioned, it may have been Caroline, she had mentioned when she had asked about my first son's birth. And I had told her, I went in that evening and he was born by 2 the next day. And she had said, oh, so pretty fast. And I didn't think of that. I didn't have a frame of reference on fast or not, but she was like, oh, so pretty fast. And so she had mentioned that, maybe this one would be similar because our bodies have a sort of memory about giving birth, and that if his birth only took, happened fairly quickly for an first time induction, that it's possible that Conrad's could go quicker. But even though, despite being told that, and when I called and she's like, call me back at the 12-hour mark, I still had, okay, well, I guess I'll just call back at the 12-hour mark, or otherwise, hopefully I'll know. Because I think in my mind, before going into labor, I had figured that my water breaking would be a good indicator of being ready to go. And then, of course, that got thrown out the window when I woke up to my water breaking. And so I was like, well, okay, I guess I'll just head her around. And I think right when I decided to call, or shortly before I called her, I was starting to notice more discomfort in my contractions. I was having to kind of find ways to get comfortable now. And I had heard about a rebozo on your podcast. So I did have a rebozo, and I like the sounds of that. And I kind of coached my husband on how to help me. And I had decided to not get a doula. 2 reasons. One, when I initially got pregnant, I didn't know how COVID was going to impact having a doula. And so I wasn't sure that would be an option for me. It turned out that in the birth center, doula would have been an option. I would have been able to have a doula. And then the other thing was that by the time I started considering it, I wasn't financially prepared to have, I was like, oh, well, it's kind of out of my budget. And I should have, if I wanted a doula, I should have thought about this sooner. And so I was really going to be relying a lot on my husband to help me through giving birth. And the other reason is I tend to kind of go internal. I don't typically seek a lot of external help when I'm dealing with challenges. And so I kind of knew that about myself too, that I would be probably more internal than externally needing help and support. So I was really counting on my husband. So I did like the sound of a rebozo, because I thought that was a nice tool that he could help me in finding comfort with. And I kind of coached him on a few ways that we could use that. But I still wasn't in so much discomfort that I felt like I needed help at that point, 8 o'clock or maybe 8:30 or so. But I had been kind of tracking my contractions on my phone. And I did get to a point where I was kind of done toting my phone around. And then I thought, well, maybe I should try getting in the shower to get a little more comfortable. And so I did try to take a shower. And I think it was when I was in the shower that things really started to pick up. And I was, okay, things are really going now. My contractions were strong enough that I had to stop and get through each one. And I could tell that they were peaking, and I would kind of tense up as they would peak, and then they would come back down. I can't remember if the shower ended up offering me much comfort, because I think I remember thinking, well, maybe I should try just going to lay down. This isn't being very helpful, but I was getting enough break in between. I was like, well, I think probably I should try to lay down and relax a little bit before anything gets too crazy, because I might have, in my head, I'm like 12 hours. I have still several hours to go, so I better try to get comfortable. And I think I went downstairs and I tried to lay down, and I realized that laying down wasn't comfortable at all. I was like, okay, laying down isn't going to happen. That was so uncomfortable. And I think by this point, it was probably getting close to 9 or 9:30-ish. I think my husband came in a couple of times to like see how I was doing. And I was still like doing pretty okay. I was still getting a lot of time in between contractions, and my contractions were only lasting like 30 or 45 seconds long, but they were definitely stronger. I could tell that I was progressing, but I wasn't having any trouble like coping yet at that point. I didn't really feel like I needed much help. So he would come in and kind of check into what I was doing and see if I needed anything. And I just encouraged him to make sure that he would be ready to go whenever, and that I would let him know if I needed any help. But I otherwise felt pretty all right. And then it was probably about 10. All of a sudden, things picked up really fast. All of a sudden, I went from being able to manage my contractions to I was struggling to manage them. And so then when my husband was coming in to try to help me, I think we briefly tried the rebozo, but we just couldn't get in sync, him and I. Like the things he was doing was like not helping. At one point, told him, I think I was like, the problem is I just am not getting a break to breathe. And in retrospect, I think I was having like contractions that were double peaking. I went from having very easy to manage to all of a sudden I was having like double peaking contractions, and with the gap in between being very short in between contractions. And I was like, I'm just not getting a chance to breathe. And he's the one who was like, doesn't that mean it's time to go in or call somebody?
Probably, especially with a second time.
Yeah, and I still had that. Well, it hasn't been 12 hours. For some reason, that 12-hour comment really stuck with me. I'm like, I still have so much time to go. It's not even close to 12 hours, which is silly because I had another midwife who was like, just come in and it'll be fine. If you're not ready, you're not ready. So I think it was probably sometime between 10:30 and 11. I called back, and I think Carol Ann is the one I spoke to. And she was like, well, it definitely sounds like you're in active labor and you should just come on in and we'll just see how it's going. And so I was like, okay, great. So I was kind of happy to have gotten that feedback. I don't know why. I was very like, I was really laissez-faire about what was going on. Like, nothing really is going on. And I didn't really articulate what my questions were very well, I feel like. But anyways, so getting that feedback from Carol Ann, I was like, all right, great. Well, we're going to go in. And then at that point, I had already had Alec, my husband, load our bags and stuff into the car because I had learned via your podcast to have my bags packed and ready to go. So I had everything packed and ready to go. I had packed our lunch earlier in the morning while I was up by myself. Our lunch was packed and we had it all ready to go. So all that was left was for me to get out the door. But at that point, my contractions were coming so fast and were double peaking. It took me a half hour just to slip shoes on and put a coat on and get into the car because I was getting only seconds in between my contraction. And it had finally started to snow. So I did need to have like socks and shoes on. It was cold out there, and coat and all that. So it was probably after 11 by the time we finally got out the door and into the car and on our way to the birth center. And I told my husband, drive with a purpose, but, be gentle because this isn't comfortable. And I think when I got in the car, I did get a little bit of a longer break than what I was getting when I was in my house. Things kind of slowed down a little bit, which was nice. But the drive actually to the birth center wasn't that hard for me. I was actually getting a little bit more relief on the drive. I think I had, even in the 10-minute drive, I think I still had 3 or 4 contractions in that 10-minute drive. And I still had it in my mind that we were just going to go get checked and see how things were going. We pulled up to the birth center, and I told my husband to leave everything in the car because I didn't know yet if we were going to be staying. So I'm like, no, don't worry about unpacking anything. I don't even know if we're going to stay or not. And I think we probably got to the birth center around 11:30 or 12-ish. I had no concept of time, but as soon as I abandoned my phone, I had lost track of everything.
You're in labor land now.
Not to tell people when I was in labor. I wanted it to be like, I had hopes of, going, having the baby, resting, and then telling everyone. So we had got to the birth center and got out and walked in and told my husband to leave everything. Oh, I should back up and say that I was also using, even though I wasn't doing anything to try to speed labor along, but I did hear from both Rebecca Decker with evidence-based birth and Ina Mae Gaskin that using evening primrose oil to soften your cervix was a good thing to try to do. And because one of my primary focuses in this birth was to reduce harm to myself, I really wanted to recover quickly. I really wanted to like have the best chances of having little harm done to me or the baby and have a quick recovery. Because again, I'm old. It takes me forever to heal.
Yeah,
And
let's
so
avoid an episiotomy maybe this time.
right, exactly. Or a bad tear. My first son was 8 pounds of ounces. So I knew I was at least expecting an 8-pound baby. And I was pretty sure this baby was going to be bigger.
Especially going later in your pregnancy.
Right. So the last 2 weeks of my pregnancy, I was using evening primrose oil. I was inserting it vaginally. And so when I got to the birth center and I had my first cervical exam when I got there, and getting on my back again, laying down was really excruciating for me. I did not like laying down, but she did do a cervical exam, but my cervix was so soft, she had a hard time finding it. She's like, so she determined I was at already 7 or 8 centimeters dilated by the time I got there. And they asked if I wanted the tub, which the tub was an option. They also had nitrous oxide. I wasn't very interested in nitrous oxide because I was worried it would make me feel like I'd lost some kind of control. I have no idea because I didn't try it, obviously, but that's what I was worried about. So I wasn't really that interested in the nitrous oxide, but I did want to try the tub. And the tub was filling. And I remember thinking that they needed to figure out some way to fill these tubs faster. It was like, this is taking us so long. And before the tub was full, I started to have the urge to push. I kept saying, I'm feeling pushy. I'm feeling pushy. Is the tub full yet? So yeah, the urge to push happened while I was waiting for the tub to fill. And that was another thing that luckily I was prepared for, that fetal ejection response, which was something I had learned in all my reading and listening. And having, now that I've experienced it, like this idea of being asked to stop doing that just seems so silly. Like I couldn't imagine if somebody had told me to stop doing that. I would have had no control over that at all. It was a pretty remarkable thing to have that. It was the craziest thing to have my body just being like, well, but since I had just been checked and I was like a 7 or 8, I was kind of like tensing up on them. The tub was finally full and I got in the tub, but I ended up not liking the tub at all. I just couldn't get comfortable. And then the other problem was that every time I had an urge to push, I was getting really tense because the last time I was checked, I was only 7 or 8 centimeters dilated. So I was afraid that I wasn't fully dilated. And in the tub, the midwives were having a hard time checking to see if I was fully dilated.
Sure.
So I couldn't confidently, I still kept tensing up because I didn't know if I was fully dilated or not. I wasn't in the tub for very long before I got back out. And then she checked and I fully dilated. But it was pretty quick from the time that I got there to the time that I was fully dilated. And the pushing phase with my first was so quick. I guess I must have assumed that it would have been quick with this one, but it actually, pushing took me probably an hour and a half to maybe even 2 hours of pushing, which I wasn't expecting at all. Because with Lando, it was like 2 or 3 pushes and he was out. Or was how I remember it at least. And so I did a lot of, mostly I was on my hands and knees. I really liked being on like the edge of the bed. In retrospect, and everything seemed to be happening so fast, I wonder if I would have liked the birthing stool, because at one point my arms and my legs were so tired from holding myself up. So I'm probably, if I had a doula, I think maybe that would have been something that would have like been like, hey, maybe you would like this. I was getting so tired by the end of it of holding my own weight up.
Yeah, that's a long time to be on hands and knees.
Yeah, and I did try a couple of times to move to my side and my back, but it just felt excruciating to be on my side and my back. I just couldn't get comfortable that way. And so, yeah, I was probably pushing for an hour and a half or 2 hours. And I kept on thinking, like, when am I going to go to Laborland? I kept hearing all the women talking about Laborland, but I am here and I am present and I am not in Laborland. I want to be in Laborland, but I am very present at this moment.
Aside from not looking at the clock. Yeah. Losing the sense of timing, but yeah, interesting. Yeah, some people feel more present than others.
Yeah, and I remember I wish I was in this Laborland. I'm not in Laborland. I am here and I am doing this and there's no getting out of it. There were a couple of moments where I was like, what was I thinking? You know, there's no getting out of it now. Now I'm too far in. I'm here. But those thoughts were fleeting. I think that may have been like transition possibly when I was like, what was I thinking? But quickly you're like, well, I'm here and I'm doing this. And so those thoughts are not helpful. I remember feeling the baby moving. Like I remember feeling him turning into position. And if it hadn't been for the midwife telling me, because she must have saw me like tense up or jump or move or react to him moving a little bit. And she was the one who was like, he's just moving into position. And her telling me that that's what was going on was really helpful. And it was just amazing. I couldn't believe that I could feel him moving. And it was just an amazing thing. It's not something you think about until it happens. And then just an incredible thing to feel. And the ring of fire was really real. I have, I think, a mental barrier there with fully committing to pushing him out. I think that was a part of what was taking time, was I had a lot of a mental barrier there with just committing, I guess. And I ended up, I think I pushed and got his head out first, and he was a bit stuck, I think. She had to kind of reach in and move his arm. His arm was in a weird position. She had to kind of sweep his arm back over to his side. And at some point I had ended up on my back when I pushed his head out, I think because I was getting too weak in my arms to hold myself up. And so I had ended up on my back and I pushed his head out, and a midwife, Michelle, needed me to get back onto my hands and knees because of the way I think the baby was stuck. And she was telling me she needed me to flip back over. And I remember when I had flipped onto my back to push, it felt like I could barely do that. And I needed to flip back over onto my hands and knees. And she was telling me I needed to flip back over. And I was saying that I wasn't sure if I could. And she said, well, we're going to help you. And I think I said, I don't think I can. And then I remember she looked me right in the eyes and she's like, you need to move over. She was very clear with me, like, this isn't a choice. You have to move onto your hands and knees. So then I did. It was like, there's, when somebody's very clear with you, no, you have to get I need you to flip over so we can get the baby out. And so I did. I flipped over, and it was just a couple more pushes. And then he finally found his way out. And it was very relieving. I was just so relieved that he was out, and I was so exhausted. And they wanted me to flip back over again so that they hand me the baby. And I was like, there's no way I'm going to be able to flip back over again. I was so tired. I'm like, I can't flip. But I did. I flipped back over and found out that he was a boy, and I was thrilled. And I should say, my husband, the whole time, obviously, he was there holding my hands, and he was right there beside me the whole time. None of the coping mechanisms I thought I would use or like, I didn't use any of them or like any of them. Everything happened so fast that it didn't even get a chance for some of them.
It was about 8.5 hours-ish, something in that, from the time your water broke?
My water broke at 5:15, and then he was born at 1:53 p.m. So it was about 8.5 hours from the time that I woke up with my water. It was, 8.5 hours from the time that it broke till the time that he was born. Yeah. And I was in labor the whole time, obviously, but the time that it was like active labor felt very quick. Like it went from being nothing going on to all of a sudden everything happening is how it felt at the time.
Maybe around 5 hours in. I think you said in the 10 o'clock hours when it really suddenly shifted.
Yeah. Yep. Exactly.
And you had brought up, when you sent me your written birth story, you brought up something about the TENS unit. Did you end up using that?
Yeah, so I did get a TENS unit with the intention of using it, but then it never even crossed my mind to grab it. I checked with my midwives. I had one myself, and there was even one at the birth center that they had. I believe that I heard about the TENS unit on your show. The Rebozo, I didn't get to use that. And then the other thing that I thought I would like was the tub, and I ended up really hating the tub.
Never know. It's just good to have the toolkit, have these things at the ready just in case, because you never know what's going to be the golden coping thing. Yeah,
definitely. And then I delivered the placenta, and that was easy. I did have just a small external tear on my labia, and she just put like a stitch in just to be safe. But otherwise, I didn't suffer any tearing. Conrad was 9 pounds, 10 ounces. So he was bigger than Landon. And I was at the birth center for a couple of hours after he was born. My pulse was still really high. I think I was dehydrated. And so they wanted to make sure I was hydrated and that my pulse went back to normal. So I was there probably, I don't think we left until 6:30 or 7 that evening after he was born. And we went home. I had envisioned being in labor during a snowstorm, and it was snowing, but I didn't get to, I thought I'd be looking out the window watching the snow fall. I didn't see any snow falling. I didn't see snow again until we walked outside and everything was covered in snow. So I had envisioned this nice, serene environment, but I didn't see any of the snow, not until we left.
Yeah. Did you find that you were closing your eyes a lot in labor, or just not looking out the window?
I think my eyes were closed a lot. I did make a lot of eye contact with my husband, held my hands a lot, and was right there with me. But yeah, I'd say I did go internal quite often. And I think that probably like the midwives, Michelle, I say midwives, it was Michelle, and then she had a birth assistant with her. And so sometimes I'd be like, oh, ow, ow, ow. And she'd be like, what's ow? But I'm saying it to myself, but I'm not saying it to her. So I was having a hard time vocalizing a lot of what was going on inside my head. I probably, for the whole process from start to finish, I did a lot of like processing it inside and not being very good at communicating around me to the people around me what was going on. But Michelle and her birth were really good at asking, trying to sort out. They worked through it. They worked out through like, ow, ow, what's ow? Everything. They did a good job of like sorting out whether it was like a bad ow or figured it out. They figured out what
vocalization. Yeah. Yeah. Going back to pushing and when the midwife had you flip on your back and then had you flip back onto the hands and knees, that reminded me of the Gaskin maneuver. And I kind of wonder if did they ever mention shoulder dystocia, that the shoulder was stuck at all?
Only that she said that she had to reach in and move his arm out of the way. But I don't think that she specifically had said that to me. But I do remember hearing that in Ina May Gaskin's book. And in retrospect, I think that's probably what's going on because he was so big. He was just struggling to make his way out of the birth canal. Yeah. And so I do think that's probably why she had me flip back over and needed me back over, because I think when I was on my back, he wasn't budging. Right. And that's why she had to really look me in the eyes and be very clear that she needed me to flip over. And it wasn't a choice, and that we were going to find a way to get me back onto my hands and knees again. Whether everyone needed to flip me or whether I was going to do it myself, I was going to I had to. There wasn't a choice about it. So.
Yeah. And that's something that a lot of OBs are trained in, the Gaskin maneuver. And so I'm really grateful that you were with a provider who knew that and knew a technique to help the baby to be able to exit through the pelvis and through the vagina. Mm-hmm.
Most definitely. I couldn't have imagined the way it felt to be like on my back and on my side. It makes me often think back to birthing or being on my back the whole time with Landon. I just couldn't imagine. It's just an interesting idea that it was obviously not what my body wanted. And so I do wonder, like having an epidural and being on my back the whole time. It's just kind of interesting to realize how much my body didn't like that, especially with big babies. I guess it's amazing to me that Landon was born with no major complications. Like I feel almost lucky, because if I had been in that situation with Conrad, I'm not sure, because of how big he was, that birthing on my back would have been successful at all.
Yeah. Yeah, it could easily have moved to a cesarean. So yay that you were with those midwives. Great.
She did ask me if I wanted to. They asked Alex if he wanted to cut the cord. He's like, no. There were a couple of times that they asked me if I wanted to reach down and feel what was going on, but I didn't want any of that. I was like too focused on my mission, and so I couldn't do any of that. And then she did ask if I wanted to see my placenta when it was, a few hours after he was born, and she brought it out. And she was very excited to show me. And it was really cool because it was that velamentous cord insertion, which what's interesting is if you think about a cord, an electrical cord, it's got like multiple wires inside of it. And then it's got like the casing on the outside of it. And so that you can imagine that would be an umbilical cord. And those are the blood vessels inside. But with a velamentous cord insertion, it's attached to the side, and it's almost like the outer casing has been removed. And so the wires are splayed, or the blood vessels are kind of splayed and attached that way. And so it was really cool to kind of see. And also Michelle and her birth enjoyed having an opportunity to take a look at it too. So that was really cool. She showed me the side that was attached to the uterus and the side that was facing the baby and all that. So that was really cool.
You happen to get any pictures, did you?
I wish I had. I didn't take nearly as many pictures as I should have. It was really cool. A placenta was way bigger than I thought it would be for some reason. I don't know why I didn't expect it to be so big, but placentas are large. They're really a full organ, which it's one thing to hear about it. It's totally another thing to actually see it with your own eyes. So that was really cool. I enjoyed that.
Yeah, and that's not for everyone. Some people are like, no, thank you. I don't want to see that. And you don't have to decide that in advance, but some care providers might offer for you to see it. And for those of us who enjoy seeing biology, it's kind of cool. Nice. So how did these two births compare? I know you shared something with me that I thought was really beautiful, but could you share with listeners the difference for you? Or it could be multiple differences, or kind of the theme, the way you would think about Landon's and then Conrad's births.
With Landon, I would describe the labor and delivery as being easy and the recovery being really quite challenging. But with Landon, I really learned my capacity to love with him. I really didn't know that I could love so deeply and love another person so much and so instantly. And so I really learned how to love somebody with Landon. And then with Conrad, the labor and delivery was more challenging, but my recovery was pretty swift. A matter of a week or two before I was really feeling much better compared to 6 or 7 weeks. But with Conrad, I learned to love my body again, and I learned to trust my body again. That had kind of been taken from me, that trust in my body in that miscarriage. And having an unmedicated physiological birth and letting my body take charge, really take the lead and trusting what it was doing. And I did. I really learned to believe in my body, believe that it's powerful, and have trust in it again. I think that the two main differences, also because I didn't know the gender of the baby, and then combined with so much anxiety about the pregnancy being viable, I didn't bond with the baby in pregnancy like I did with Landon. And I also think that I didn't have that instant bond like I did with Landon, which was humbling to experience, I guess, because even though you hear about different bonding times, I think that even with different babies, with your own babies, you can have experience a different time when you bond with them. Like with Landon, it was so instantaneous, where with Conrad, it was probably a couple of days before I really was like, I know you and I love you. And you know what I mean? Not that I didn't love him, but I really, after a couple of days, really started to bond with him. So I do think, like I said, a combination of maybe not knowing the gender, being anxious. And then, of course, there was just the processing, the giving birth itself were all things that I was doing after he was born, which was a little maybe different than with Landon.
Thank you so much for sharing that. Well, is there anything that you haven't gotten to share yet that you were hoping to share, or any final tips or insights for listeners?
Sure. I've probably got a couple of things. I breastfed both babies. With Landon, it was so easy. In fact, and I was very young and very naive, I think. I remember when I would hear people talk about breastfeeding being painful or difficult, I remember thinking, well, then you must be doing something wrong, because it's quite easy. I didn't have any challenges. And with Conrad, he wasn't nearly as good as Landon. And what I realized is that I wasn't giving Landon the credit that he deserved for being such an easy baby. I was taking all the credit for how easy our breastfeeding journey was, because then when I had Conrad, he really had to learn how to latch. And I also didn't have to pump and go back to work with Landon. I stayed at home with him. And I did have to pump and go back to work with Conrad. And pumping is another challenge that I didn't realize would be such a challenge. I'd say that nursing the baby is more enjoyable. And I think that pumping is not enjoyable.
Most of us don't enjoy that.
I also struggle a lot with clogged ducts. And I think that's related to pumping, where when I was just nursing, I never had issues with clogged ducts. And then it's also a little bit of just, pumping at work is a whole thing, which in the state of Washington, I don't know if it's a national thing, but at least in the state of Washington, employers have to allow you to pump. They have to provide you a space to pump. And so even with all that, it's still like a weird adjustment. I'm just, by my personality, I'm a hard worker, and having to stop and take a break and to stop and pump and do that, just a challenge for me to make that a priority.
I remember feeling like that too.
I don't like feeling like a weak link in the chain, I guess is probably what it is. And just understanding that it didn't make me a weak link in the chain, and that I had to work it into my normal day, and just learning how to do that.
Oh, thanks for sharing all of that. That's, first of all, it's really encouraging. I'm so glad to have you sharing on the podcast one example of it came easily with my first. Breastfeeding did, because that is all too uncommon to hear that. And, at least statistically speaking, we think that 90% of us have some challenges in the early weeks. So it's really nice to find the 10%, to find someone who's like, no, it was actually really easy. My mom said it was really easy for her, but also interesting your perspective and different experiences from one child to the next.
Yeah, Conrad had a really shallow latch. He didn't have any tongue. I had to check for like tongue tie and stuff, and that wasn't the issue. He just was maybe overeager or something. It was really quite painful every time he would latch. It's like, oh my goodness, what are you doing wrong here, dude? This is not working out. And I think on one of my follow-ups with my midwife, which I had several of, which was different than Landon. Landon, I only saw my obstetrician once after 6 weeks, but I saw my midwife several times right after he was born. And she explained to me that what was happening is he would basically latching, and then when the baby would suck the nipple in, it goes up across the tongue, which is kind of like sandpaper on your nipple in a way. And so that kind of causes like cracks and just abrasion on it's just hard on the nipple compared to a baby who goes in with a big wide mouth and it takes in a good mouthful. Instead, he's just taking in a little bit and then sucking it across his tongue. And it was just so painful. And yeah, I definitely didn't give Landon the credit he deserved for our breastfeeding, for sure.
He's different.
Yeah, definitely. The other thing I would just probably like to mention is more about some of the paid family leave and stuff that we have going on in Washington. It was a night and day difference for me. And I think probably for Conrad, it just my husband's ability to also get paid time off with me and for me to have paid time off. And we got a full 12 weeks. This was my husband's first baby. And so he really got a good crash course in learning to take care of the baby. And him and Conrad have an excellent relationship. He's a great father. And I trust, with Landon, I didn't trust anybody with the baby, including Landon's own father, because he went straight back to work. I did all of his care. But with my husband and I having that time off together and both learning how to take care of Conrad and both having trust in each other, it just made a huge difference in how I felt and how he felt. It's a game changer, basically, being able to have that paid leave. And then the other thing that Washington just passed in the beginning of March, which I thought would be fun to mention, is that I can't remember the name of the bill right now, but they passed a bill in like the first week of March that midwives, I think licensed midwives and certified practicing midwives or practitioner midwives are allowed to give contraceptive care. So now in Washington State, you can get that care through your midwives also. So that's kind of monumentous here in Washington too. I feel lucky to be in Washington and also most insurances in the state of Washington are going to cover most types of births. That's including a home birth, birth center birth, or a hospital birth. And I don't know if many people realize, and at least I didn't realize, that we have so many options here in Washington, that they're so available to us. It's good to know what your options are and that you have many of them. So
great. Thank you for sharing that. I'll have to maybe either follow up with you or do a little online poking around to find links that I can include in the show notes for that information in case people want to learn more about that in Washington. Well, thank you, Melissa. It has been so wonderful to hear all the juicy details about your journeys through pregnancy and birth and hear those differences and the different choices you made this most recent time around. So thank you.
Yeah. Thank you too. And again, your podcast was so valuable to me and I imagine to many women. And I hope that we keep this going. I hope that we continue culturally to embrace talking about and normalizing birth and talking about the positive things that come from it.
Many thanks again to Melissa for sharing her story. I know this was a long episode, so today I'll very briefly teach just about a few things that came up today. Velamentous cord insertion, how choice of care provider can increase or reduce anxiety, double peaking contractions, episiotomy, and shoulder dystocia. First, velamentous cord insertion. I think Melissa's description was a really helpful visual. Velamentous cord insertion occurs when the blood vessels on the umbilical cord are partially exposed. It occurs in only about 1% of singleton or single fetus pregnancies and around 9% of twin pregnancies. With twin pregnancies, it's more likely to happen when the twins share a placenta. It's also more common with IVF pregnancies, quite a few of which result in twins. I'd love to just point out here that while this is an extra risk factor, it's so nice to know that Melissa wasn't risked out from working with a midwife in a birthing center despite having it. Particularly if you're someone who's experiencing anxiety, whether it's pregnancy loss related or not, Melissa's story is a powerful demonstration on the physiologically positive effects choosing the best care provider for you can have. It's also a powerful testimonial about how different the care can be from one provider to the next. A quick note regarding the double peaking contractions Melissa mentioned. This pattern can often be a sign of a posterior positioned baby or a baby who has their head down but back to the birthing parent's back instead of toward their belly. I taught a bit about episiotomy, which is a surgical incision in the perineal tissue, the tissue in between the anus and the vagina, in the end notes of episode 41, so I'll link to that in the show notes. Short story is that it's almost always better in terms of healing and protecting the integrity of the pelvic floor muscles to heal from a natural tear instead of a surgical incision. I talked about shoulder dystocia in episode 93, which is also linked in this episode's show notes. There, I explain a few basic things. One thing I didn't mention in that episode is the Gaskin maneuver. This is a technique developed by well-known midwife Ina May Gaskin, who wrote a book that's been mentioned many times on this podcast, Ina May's Guide to Childbirth. The Gaskin maneuver helps a baby be born without complication who's experiencing shoulder dystocia, meaning when baby's shoulder gets a bit stuck due to the baby's size or sometimes due to the baby's position or parent's position. The first part of this technique is to have the birthing person move onto all fours, and the insistence of the midwife in Melissa's story to do this is why I suspect this was likely a case of shoulder dystocia. I'll link to information on the different techniques to resolve shoulder dystocia in the show notes for this episode, episode 105, over at birthmattersshow.com. Okay, we're coming to the end of the season. Here's a sneak peek of what's up in our final birth story for season 3.
Doulas are not just for natural birth. They're not just for people who don't want to use an epidural or want to have a home birth or a water birth. If anything, it's for the people who are planning on engaging in this medical system. You need a doula more than anybody needs a doula because you're having an epidural, you're planning on that. Great. You need someone who's advocating for you when that epidural doesn't work correctly or when it stalls your labor or when you need to help move the baby down. There's like positioning. There's all sorts of things. I would argue the more medical care you're desiring or expecting to use, the more you need that support as you navigate it.
Here are 2 different quotes for you to ponder this week. Both are from a book Melissa mentioned liking, Birth Without Fear by January Harshey. We'll post these 2 quotes on Instagram over at Birth Matters NYC and would love for you to share the one that resonates more for you. The first is, "Anxiety is a liar. Breathe, my beautiful friend. You got this." And the second is this, "We have to surrender and let go, and it's in that vulnerability we find the courage and strength we forgot we've had since our own birth. The power is already in you." If you enjoyed today's episode, please share with a friend. Be sure to subscribe or follow if you're not already, wherever you're listening. Leave us a review and even sign up for our email list if you haven't. You can do that over at birthmattersshow.com. Thank you so much for listening to the Birth Matters podcast. Please stay tuned for the final episode of season 3 coming soon, and be well.